The closest most of us ever come to gunpowder is at a fireworks display. Gunpowder is still the main component of most fireworks. It is classed as a low explosive and used mainly for its propellant effect, unlike high explosives, such as dynamite, which are used for their destructive effect. For example, in the mining and quarrying industries. Gunpowder is now rarely used in modern warfare. More powerful and deadly explosive substances have been developed. But gunpowder was the very latest in warfare technology when it was first introduced to Europe in the 14th century. Discovered by the ancient Chinese, the process of making gunpowder is relatively simple, being a mixture of 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal and 10% sulphur. For a long time, England relied on foreign imports, but in time of war this was hardly a satisfactory state of affairs. England's enemies were usually from the continent, and so a site in the south of the country was needed. Looking at the town today, it's hard to believe that Faversham was probably the birthplace of the national gunpowder industry, the first works being established during or just before the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. In fact, it would have been difficult to find a site more suitable in the south of England. There were streams rising in the North Downs that fed its creek. These provided power for water mills and a safer method of transporting dangerous substances within the works. 2 of the 3 ingredients of gunpowder, sulphur and saltpeter, had to be imported, so being a seaport was a huge advantage. The 3rd ingredient was charcoal. Faversham was surrounded by coppice woodland, which provided a ready supply of wood for its manufacture. Later in the industry's history, the wide uninhabited stretches of marshland beyond the town were to provide a safer area for making even more dangerous materials, such as gun cotton and TNT. Faversham's earliest known gunpowder maker was Thomas Gill, who was known to be working in the town in 1573. During Oliver Cromwell's time, there was a new wave of European hostility to England's Republican government. As a result, the navy was doubled. One Faversham manufacturer, Daniel Judd, made enough profit from gunpowder to build himself a fine new house at Sindale, just outside Faversham. Although most of the house was burned down in the 1960s, the site, now a motel, is still referred to as Judd Folly. From the late 17th century, Huguenot refugees from Catholic persecution in France arrived in England in large numbers. Some settled in Faversham, starting a new powder factory in 1684. They held church services, in French, at Davington and Preston, and had their own ministers. The descendants of the Huguenots were involved in the industry for over 125 years. In the early days of the Faversham industry, the gunpowder was mixed by hand in a pestle and mortar. Later, horse or water-driven mechanical hammers were used to pound the powder. In about 1735, these were superseded by edge-runner mills. The materials were placed in a trough on top of a circular stone bed. 1 or 2 heavy stones, or edge-runners, rolled round and round, reducing the ingredients to a fine powder. The first gunpowder works in the town became known as the Home Works. It was almost a mile long, stretching from near the A2 at Ospringe to the head of the creek, and including what is now St Anne's Park, a modern housing estate. The name St Anne's has a direct link with Faversham's early gunpowder industry. St Anne's House was built for the director of the Royal Gunpowder Factory, the name given to the Home Works in 1759 when it was taken over by the government. Unfortunately, this house was demolished in 1963. Although the Home Works was the first Faversham gunpowder factory, more of it survives than any of the others. The most striking surviving feature of the original works is the Stonebridge Pond. This owes its layout to the fact that the streams and miniature inlets were used as a relatively safe method of transporting dangerous materials. The stream that originally fed the pond also powered what are now the most impressive remains of all the gunpowder factories, the Chart Mills. These incorporating mills, where the ingredients were blended, are the only surviving examples in the country. They had been abandoned for many years, but in 1967 the Faversham Society undertook their restoration. And they are now open to the public. Sometime after the establishment of the home works in the 16th century, another gunpowder factory, the ore works, was built alongside the stream flowing into Ore Creek. Many of the buildings from the 19th century have been demolished or allowed to fall into disrepair. However, within the next few years, the ore works will be open as a countryside and industrial history park. Most of the remaining buildings will be conserved, footpaths will be cleared, and an information centre will be built. This will encourage more visitors to explore and learn about this historic site. By its very nature, the production of gunpowder was a dangerous business. The buildings were constructed with pine boards, loosely fastened, so that in the event of an explosion there would be very little resistance and hence less damage. Tall trees were grown to absorb the shock of accidental explosions, and this has left the town with a legacy of several areas of magnificent mature trees where the mills once stood. Even so, nothing could prevent damage over a wide area when a large explosion occurred. After a disastrous explosion in 1781, which killed 3 men and did considerable damage, the government decided that the more dangerous processes be transferred to a less populated area. It's possible that Davington Priory lost its second tower as a result of one of the 2 major explosions in the mid-18th century. These new works to the north of the town became known as the Marsh works. Most of this area is now used by Bretts for sand and gravel extraction, but there are still many reminders of the site's past history, especially from the 19th and early 20th centuries. This photo was taken outside the main entrance to the Marsh works during the First World War. The house is now occupied as a dwelling. Brett still used some of the buildings for offices and stores. It was at the Marsh works that stringent safety regulations were first introduced to protect workers from the more dangerous processes that were carried out there. Many of the rules related to avoiding accidental sparks. Workers could be fined for wearing shoes with iron nails in certain parts of the factory. In fact, wearing the correct clothing remained vitally important for all the workers, and as a result, by the beginning of the 20th century, explosives factory workers wore distinctive uniforms with bone buttons and no buckles or metal adornment. The distinctive triangular badges worn by the workers would help identify the bodies of victims in the event of an explosion. By the time of the Napoleonic Wars, at the beginning of the 19th century, output at Faversham reached 580 tons of gunpowder per year. The labour force numbered 400, just under a quarter of the town's male population. Production was continuous, with shift work being in operation, and the manufacture of the powder gradually completed as it passed down the stream to the creek for transportation by barge in what was an early version of an assembly line. Much of the explosive material produced at Faversham was used in civil engineering, such as railway and canal building, and not, as might be imagined, for warfare. Indeed, it might be said that the Industrial Revolution could never have taken place without explosives from Faversham. In 1854, the Home, Ore and Marsh gunpowder works were all owned by one company, John Hall and Son. Hall was to become one of the important Faversham names. William, John's son, established a girls' school in 1848 in a building now occupied as a bungalow on the edge of Stonebridge Pond. In 1861, the school moved to a larger site on land provided by Hall in Tanner Street. In 1910, the building became the Empire Picture Hall, Faversham's first cinema. Later, it was converted to its present use, the town's Roman Catholic church. The Hall family also built Brent's Parish Church, now deconsecrated. The cottage hospital was built to the memory of William Hall in 1887 and is still in use today. In the mid-19th century, it was John Hall's company which obtained patent rights and built the first gun cotton factory in the world, at the Marsh Works. Purified cotton, steeped in a mixture of nitric and sulfuric acid, and then dried, produced an explosive 6 times more powerful than ordinary gunpowder. But after only 6 months, a disastrous explosion killed 20 people and caused considerable damage to the surrounding area. Production of gun cotton was halted and remaining stocks buried. It was the Crimean War in 1854 that brought another expansion to the Marsh works. In 1860, another new explosive, dynamite, made its appearance. The inventor, Alfred Nobel, offered the British patent rights to John Hall and Son for £500. This time they cautiously declined the offer. A large number of the 300 operatives at the Faversham works were women, many of whom were working on cannonite, a smokeless sporting and rifle powder produced in cartridges. Blasting powders and cartridges were in great demand for coal mining and quarrying. Eventually, with the disaster of 1847 long past, gun cotton was again manufactured at Faversham, but this time production was moved to the flat land on the shore of the Swale, opposite the Isle of Harty. This isolated area was ideal for the production of more dangerous explosives. The new works faced a navigable tideway, and as the companies had their own fleets of barges, this allowed easy loading and unloading of materials from jetties built out into the river estuary. Steam power now operated much of the machinery. Companies had their own docks, slipways and loading areas. There were 4.5 miles of narrow-gauge tramways with a suitable range of rolling stock, and the Davington Light Railway took workers from Faversham out to the high explosives factories on the Swale. The industry had never been so efficient. Even so, accidents still happened. But it was during the 1914-18 war that there occurred the worst disaster in the history of the Faversham explosives industry. On April 2, 1916, an explosion of 80 tons of TNT caused the deaths of over 100 employees. As well as the appalling loss of life, the explosion caused vast damage to the factory and adjacent premises of the Cotton Powder Company's factory. "70 of the victims were buried in a mass grave in the town cemetery. After the First World War, a new holding company, Explosives Trades Limited, amalgamated most of the major businesses. By 1920, it had been renamed Nobel Industries Limited, which soon after became part of the Imperial Chemical Industries Company. Being so close to Europe had become a critical handicap, with the town now vulnerable to both bombing and invasion. In 1934, ICI closed the last 3 Faversham factories and transferred production to Ardere in Scotland. However, one factory remains in the town as a link with the explosives industrial past. Known as the Abbey Works, it is situated on the east bank of the creek. They make components of carbon dioxide blasting cartridges used in the mining industry. Although this is the only firm with a direct link to the explosives industry, there are still plenty of traces of the old factories. In our shop here, you can buy books and picture postcards illustrating the town's explosive past. You'll also find books about other sites and the history of the industry in general. From April to October, you can join a guided tour of some of the features of the home works. This includes a visit to Chart Mills. For more information on the free Faversham Gunpowder Trail or any other aspect of the town's explosives industry, please ask a member of the museum staff.